Tonight, we're not chasing heroes through marble palaces, nor sitting beneath thrones of thunder. No, tonight we step softly into an older kind of tale. A story once told beneath open skies, where firelight flickered on tired faces, and even the gods felt almost human. If stories like this bring you a moment of peace, then please give this little channel a like. Subscribe if you'd like to stay close, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I truly love knowing where these quiet stories find their way. Now, dim the lights just a little, turn down the hum of the fan, and rest gently on one side of your bed. Take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day fade slowly away. Because tonight, we're going back to a time of myth, of moonlight, and the birth of Hercules.
Born between gods and men. The city of Thebes did not glitter like Olympus. It breathed instead, with dust, smoke, and the heavy scent of olive oil burning in clay lamps. There, beneath roofs of sun-baked tile and courtyards shaded by fig trees, lived a woman whose patience was legend, Alcmene. Her husband, Amphitryon, had gone to war, as men so often did in the tales of Greece, chasing honor, revenge, or perhaps just the illusion of peace. His absence left the house quiet, except for the murmuring of servants and the occasional sigh of the wind through bronze shutters. And far above, Zeus watched, the king of gods, master of storms, breaker of vows. For all his majesty, he had the heart of a restless wanderer and the weaknesses of a man. Alcmene's beauty was not of the blinding kind that poets exaggerate. It was quieter, like water over stone. She did not seek attention. Perhaps that was why she drew it from heaven itself. Zeus descended from Olympus, clothed not in thunder, but in deception. He took Amphitryon's form, the same voice, the same weary smile of a soldier returning home. And that night, under a sky heavy with rain and the faint growl of distant thunder, he stretched time itself. One night became 3. The stars moved slowly, as though the heavens too were caught in the spell. When dawn finally came, Thebes was unchanged, but the world had shifted. A seed had been planted in the fragile balance between divine and mortal. A child who would carry both lightning and sorrow in his veins. Moments later, the real Amphitryon returned. His armor was dented, his eyes shadowed with war. When Alcmene greeted him with the warmth of reunion, confusion clouded his face. She spoke of a night they had not yet shared. Silence filled the space between them, that fragile, sharp silence that lives right before truth breaks through. When it did, it struck like thunder. Zeus's trick was uncovered, and in the heavens, Hera, the queen of gods, felt the tremor of betrayal once again. Hera's anger was a legend even among immortals. She could not strike Zeus without shaking the very order of the cosmos, so she turned her wrath upon those who could bleed, upon Alcmene and the child that now grew within her. Time passed. The city hummed with ordinary life, unaware that destiny was being written in one quiet household. But when Alcmene's hour came, Hera struck again, cruel and precise. She sent her daughter, Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, to twist the threads of time, to trap the woman in endless labor, pain without end, a birth that would never arrive. Hours blurred into days. Alcmene cried out to gods who would not answer, every contraction a wave that could not break. But humans, for all their fragility, possess a cunning that even the gods forget to fear. Alcmene's servant, Galanthus, watched and waited, and in one desperate moment she shouted, "The child is born!" Startled, Eileithyia gasped, her hands unclenched, her spell shattered, and in that instant the world changed. The cries of a newborn split the silence of Thebes. A boy, impossibly strong, impossibly loud. They named him Hercules, glory of Hera, a cruel irony chosen by Zeus himself as if to mock the queen whose fury had nearly ended him. But Hera was not finished, not even close. That night, while the household slept, she sent 2 serpents to the child's cradle. They slithered across the floor, silent as spilled ink, their scales glinting faintly in the torchlight. The baby stirred, then grasped. Tiny fingers curled around living muscle. When the nurse entered moments later, she found the serpents limp, their bodies knotted like discarded ropes, and the infant Hercules cooing softly, as if nothing at all had happened. Word spread. Prophets whispered that the child would shake the foundations of the world. Some said he would destroy the old order, others that he would save it. Alcmene simply held him closer. For though he was born of gods, she saw in his eyes something achingly human, a confusion, a wildness, and a flicker of loneliness that would never quite leave him. And high above, Hera watched. Every cry of that child was a reminder of Zeus's faithlessness. Every breath he took was an insult she could not forgive. The heavens do not forget easily, and in that silent vow, to make the child suffer for his father's sins, the story of Hercules truly began.
The childhood of a demigod. Even as a newborn, Hercules carried the weight of the world on shoulders too small to bear it. The city of Thebes hummed gently, unaware that a boy was growing whose fists could strangle serpents and whose arms would someday lift mountains. But the gods, for all their power, rarely rested, and Hera, scorned, sharp, relentless, had not forgotten the child who mocked her carefully laid plans from the very moment of birth. From his earliest days, she tested him. Nurses whispered of strange accidents, lampstands tipping over without touch, small fires flickering around his cradle, shadows moving as though alive. But Hercules laughed, a baby's laugh, and cooed as if the chaos were part of a familiar game. It was a game, of course, though the rules were unknown even to him. Alcmene, wise and patient, watched over him with care. She taught him the first words, showed him the first steps, and encouraged him to reach for the world, even as it tried to push him down. By the age of 3, he was no longer merely a child. He could wrestle grown men's dogs, lift the family hearthstone, and climb walls with a strength that left servants speechless. Neighbors whispered. They said he was more than mortal. Some feared him, some envied him. Some, the older, wiser women of the city, simply shook their heads, muttering that Zeus's blood ran too violently in that boy's veins. But Heracles' childhood was not just defined by power. Even a demigod needs guidance. Alcmene sent him to the tutors that Greece could provide, masters of letters, of music, and of philosophy. He learned to read the stars, to measure the flight of arrows, to speak with clarity. Yet he struggled with the gentle arts. A lyre would slip from his hands, a delicate vase would shatter beneath the weight of his curiosity. Strength was his gift and his burden. Hera, meanwhile, escalated her subtle attacks. She sent venomous snakes into his crib once more. But Heracles, still just a boy, strangled them without effort. His laughter echoed through the halls. Alcmene whispered, half in awe, half in fear, "What manner of child have we raised?" Schooling did not quell his restlessness. Games with other children often ended in chaos. Chasing one boy too far, he sent him tumbling into a fountain. Lifting another by the tunic, he accidentally tore it in half. Yet Heracles did not learn cruelty. He learned caution, patience, and the value of foresight, the first lessons of wisdom that only experience could teach a demigod. Even play was tinged with danger. When Heracles was barely 5, a master of arms brought him a wooden shield and spear. The boy lifted them as if they were feathers. He could swing the spear with accuracy beyond his years, and though he had no enemy to face, the villagers watched from afar, breathless. By the time he was 7, his reputation had spread beyond the walls of Thebes. Travelers, merchants, and wandering minstrels spoke in hushed tones of the boy who laughed at peril. Stories began to grow around him like ivy, twisting and climbing higher with each retelling. Some called him a blessing, others a harbinger of disaster. And yet, for all this, the boy was lonely. He was a child of 2 worlds, neither fully mortal nor fully divine. He longed for companionship, but could not find peers who matched his strength. Even his tutors sometimes recoiled, not from malice, but from fear. Fear of what he might do, and fear of what the gods might demand of him. It was in this solitude that Heracles began to understand his first truth. Power, without wisdom or restraint, can isolate even the kindest heart. Even in play, he observed the fragile lives around him and learned the silent art of mercy, the very skill that would one day distinguish him from mere beasts of strength. Yet Hera remained ever vigilant. She sent minor disasters, collapsing beams, stables filled with wild animals, and storms that seemed focused solely on Alcmene's household. Each test shaped Heracles, teaching him endurance, patience, and resilience, though he could not yet name these virtues. By the age of 10, he was no longer merely a remarkable child. He was a young man in miniature, a vessel of fury, potential, and latent greatness. Even in his laughter there was a spark of defiance, a signal that no god, not even Hera, could entirely bend him to her will. Through his childhood, Heracles learned lessons both cruel and kind. That life can be heavy and unfair, that laughter can resist pain, and that even a demigod's heart can ache for warmth, connection, and understanding. The city of Thebes carried on, largely unaware of the storm brewing in a single household. But every servant, tutor, and neighbor who watched the boy knew one thing with certainty. Heracles was destined for more than mere human life. And though he did not yet know it, his childhood, filled with laughter, trials, and danger, had forged the first sparks of the hero he would one day become. The whispers of the city, the sighs of his mother, and the unseen eyes of a jealous queen all converged silently to shape the boy who would lift the world on his shoulders.
The formative years. Heracles was no longer the fragile infant who had laughed at serpents. He was a boy whose shadow stretched long beneath the sun, whose footsteps echoed before his body even arrived. The streets of Thebes whispered his name, not always with admiration, but often with awe. Even in youth, Hera's resentment followed him. Storms seemed to trail behind his shadow. Torches would flicker as if aware of his presence. Yet for all this, Hercules faced the world with a mixture of curiosity and daring. He was a boy who could lift a full barrel without strain, yet pause to notice a bird in flight or a flower pressed against a stone wall. His mother, Alcmene, understood that power alone was not enough. She sent him to tutors who taught him letters, mathematics, music, and philosophy. Though his hands were too large for delicate instruments, he learned patience in rhythm, discipline in repetition. He was clever, more clever than his teachers often realized, able to solve riddles, calculate trajectories, and memorize lines of poetry faster than almost anyone else. Yet the lessons were never simple. Hera ensured that even play was fraught with danger. One afternoon, a herd of goats sent to graze in the hills was set loose by her subtle influence. Heracles ran after them, climbing steep cliffs, swinging from rocky ledges, and corralling the animals with astonishing strength. By the time he returned, breathless but smiling, he had learned more than any lecture could teach. The balance of force and care, speed and precision, strength and patience. Even ordinary chores became tests. He could sweep the stables clean in a single motion, yet he always paused to ensure the animals were safe. Neighbors, initially wary, began to watch in secret admiration. The boy seemed invincible, yet never cruel. Even in triumph, he carried a quiet respect for the fragility of life. It was during these years that Heracles encountered his first significant challenge outside the walls of home. A wild boar had entered the outskirts of Thebes, destroying crops and frightening villagers. No adult dared approach it. But Heracles, barely a teenager, tracked the creature. He did not strike immediately. He observed, waited, understood its patterns. Then, with a single display of calculated force, he captured it alive, guiding it gently back to the pen without harm. The villagers were stunned. Here was a boy, still growing, yet capable of extraordinary feats, and yet compassionate enough not to break what he held in his hands. Through such adventures, Heracles' character began to form. He learned courage without recklessness, power without cruelty, and wisdom tempered by humanity. And yet, even in these moments, the shadow of Hera loomed. She sent small accidents to challenge him, a beam collapsing here, a fire breaking out there. Heracles met each one not with anger, but with calm ingenuity, turning hazards into lessons, danger into mastery. He also learned from his teachers that not all battles are physical. A debate with a philosopher became as intense as wrestling a lion. Learning diplomacy, persuasion, and the subtle arts of influence would prove as vital as lifting a mountain. By the end of his teenage years, Heracles had begun to understand something essential. The world would always challenge him, gods and mortals alike. But strength, wisdom, and compassion combined could transform even the harshest trials into triumphs. And yet the boy's heart often ached. He was a child caught between two worlds, mortal and divine. He longed for friendship with equals, for a family untouched by jealousy, for a life where he could simply exist. But destiny, as always, had other plans. Even now, whispers traveled across Thebes, stories of the boy who could lift more than men, who tamed wild creatures, who solved riddles with the speed of thought began to spread beyond his city. Travelers told of a young demigod in the hills, and merchants shared tales of a boy who might one day walk among gods. Yet in private, Heracles remained grounded. He laughed, he stumbled, he learned kindness and remorse. The blend of human and divine made him complex, sometimes lonely, often misunderstood, but always remarkable. It was in these formative years that the seeds of the hero were sown. Each small victory, each narrowly avoided disaster, each test of patience or intellect, all were shaping him for the monumental challenges ahead. Hera's fury, ever present, acted as both obstacle and teacher. Without it, perhaps Heracles would have grown strong but naive. With it, he became more than mortal, more than boy. He became a force the world could not ignore. By the age of 16, Heracles had mastered feats that would astound grown men, yet carried a heart capable of tenderness and reflection. He knew already that power without control could destroy, and that strength without mercy was empty. And in this balance, the delicate dance of force, intellect, and compassion, he was beginning to become the legend the world would one day call Heracles.
First Trials Beyond Thebes. By the time Heracles reached the threshold of adulthood, Thebes had grown accustomed to his presence, though never fully at ease with it. Whispers followed him everywhere, in the marketplace, along the narrow stone streets, and even through the olive groves surrounding the city. The boy who had once lifted barrels, tamed wild goats, and bested serpents in his crib had become a young man whose very shadow seemed to command attention. Yet even this recognition did not quell the quiet unease that accompanied his every step. Hera's presence was never far, invisible but palpable. Storms brewed in his wake, livestock panicked for reasons no mortal could understand, and the small everyday accidents that haunted his family persisted with uncanny precision. It was as if the heavens themselves conspired to test him at every moment. And Heracles, though strong, had learned the early lesson of caution. Every triumph had its cost. His first ventures beyond Thebes were not for glory, but necessity. He traveled into the hills to protect villages from marauding bandits, wild animals, and the unpredictable forces of nature that seemed drawn to him. Each journey was a silent education, teaching patience, strategy, and an understanding that force alone could not solve every problem. One of his earliest trials involved a feral lion that had made the mountains its home, terrorizing shepherds and scattering flocks. Heracles tracked it silently, studying its habits with care. He observed the way it padded through the shadows, the tension in its muscles, the sharp glint of its teeth. When the moment came, he did not strike recklessly. Instead, he trapped the beast in a natural pitfall, using the terrain to his advantage, and subdued it with a combination of strength, cunning, and respect. The villagers marveled, realizing that this was no ordinary youth. He was a being of rare power, tempered by understanding. Yet every success attracted Hera's subtle wrath. She sent minor disasters to test him further. Unstable cliffs, sudden storms, even mischievous animals that could have caused great harm. Heracles learned to anticipate danger, to act swiftly yet thoughtfully, and to recognize that even the most insignificant-looking threat could become lethal in the hands of chance. These trials were not solely physical. Heracles encountered moral challenges, situations requiring judgment and compassion. He mediated disputes between villagers, resolved conflicts over property and livestock, and learned to balance his own power against the fragile needs of ordinary humans. Even at this young age, he understood that to wield strength without conscience was to risk becoming a tyrant rather than a hero. One story tells of a young woman trapped by a landslide, her cries echoing through a narrow gorge. Hercules arrived just in time. He lifted boulders with arms honed by years of physical labor and divine heritage, cleared a path, and gently guided her to safety. The villagers called him savior. He smiled quietly, aware that gratitude was fleeting and danger eternal. As he grew, he learned humility as well. Despite his formidable abilities, he was still a child of both mortal and divine blood, a combination that brought conflict. Some elders feared him, others envied him. Some young men sought to challenge him, not realizing that brute force alone would not sway a hero who had learned both patience and strategy. Through these experiences, Hercules began to comprehend the duality of his existence. He was mortal in vulnerability, yet divine in potential. He could feel pain, hunger, fear, and sorrow, yet his strength could move mountains, tame beasts, and protect the innocent. This duality became a defining feature of his character, one that would guide his decisions in the years to come. Hera's influence, though malevolent, shaped him as much as his successes. Every obstacle she placed before him became an unspoken lesson in resilience. By overcoming her subtle machinations, he learned adaptability, resourcefulness, and a form of courage that required more than muscle. It demanded intellect, foresight, and unwavering determination. In this period, Hercules also began forming the first friendships and alliances that would accompany him into adulthood. Not all were enduring, but each taught him something about loyalty, trust, and the fragile bonds that tie humans together. Even in camaraderie, he carried the weight of destiny, aware that the world often tested both strength and morality in equal measure. Beyond the immediate challenges of survival and morality, he began to cultivate a philosophy of life, one learned from experience rather than book or teacher, that life could be cruel and unpredictable, that suffering often preceded growth, and that power without restraint was a dangerous thing. He saw that heroism was not simply the act of defeating monsters or bandits, but the continuous effort to balance action with thought, impulse with wisdom, and strength with compassion. By the age of 20, Hercules had already faced trials that would have broken ordinary men. Yet he remained unbowed, his spirit tempered like steel in the forge of experience. The mountains of Thebes had become both playground and classroom, the rivers and forests both adversaries and allies. Hera's shadow lingered still, but it was no longer a terror. It was a challenge to overcome, a crucible in which he forged his courage and character. In these years, legends began to spread. Quiet tales whispered in markets and taverns, passed from shepherds to traveling merchants. Stories of a young man who could tame beasts, solve conflicts, and endure dangers beyond mortal reckoning. And even as the world slowly recognized him, the boy, now a young man, remained introspective. He questioned, reflected, and learned from every experience. He knew that the path of a hero would be long, and that the trials of his youth were only the beginning. Yet he carried hope as well, hope that despite the wrath of Hera,
despite the weight of the gods, he could shape his own destiny. By the end of this chapter of his life, Heracles was no longer a boy of extraordinary abilities. He was a young man, strong, wise, compassionate, and tempered by hardship. And though destiny had many cruel and marvelous tests ahead, he was prepared in ways that no one, not even the Queen of Olympus herself, could fully anticipate.
The first true trials. The hills beyond Thebes were no longer mere playgrounds. They had become arenas of destiny. Heracles, now entering the prime of youth, felt the weight of his powers pressing against the confines of ordinary life. He was stronger than any mortal, faster than the fleetest hunters, and yet wiser than many elders who had long since stopped chasing knowledge. And yet, strength alone could not shield him from the wrath of Hera. The Queen of Olympus, unseen but ever present, orchestrated mischief that took forms both subtle and violent. Rocks fell from cliffs as he passed, storms rose from nowhere, and animals twisted from docility to terror with barely a provocation. Each incident tested not only his body, but his mind, forcing him to anticipate the unpredictable, to think in ways ordinary humans never could. One of his earliest legendary challenges came from a creature whose name alone could chill blood, the Erymanthian boar. This monstrous beast had terrorized the countryside for years. Its tusks were sharp as bronze, its hooves thundered like a herd of storms, and it seemed possessed of a mind entirely devoted to chaos. Villagers hid in fear. Hunters had fled with shattered limbs and ruined pride. Heracles approached quietly, studying the boar from a ridge. Unlike his previous encounters, this was no beast to be tamed gently. It would not yield, would not be swayed by cunning alone. He needed a plan, a combination of strategy and raw power. For days he observed its patterns, noting the times it grazed, the paths it favored, and the gaps in its vigilance. Then, at dawn on the third day, he struck. Heracles leapt into the fray, dodging tusks, anticipating every charge, and, with a combination of grappling skill and sheer strength, he managed to trap the creature in a deep, snow-laden valley. The villagers gasped in disbelief when he returned, leading the boar bound but unharmed. It was an early sign. Heracles' power was immense, but so too was his mind. Not all his trials were beasts alone. Hera's wrath often manifested in more subtle, insidious ways. Once, while tending to a flock, a sudden landslide threatened to bury a group of children playing nearby. Heracles acted instinctively, leaping into the falling rubble, shielding the children and guiding them to safety. By the time the villagers arrived, he was covered in dust and blood, but alive, and so were the children. Through these acts, he earned the loyalty, admiration, and sometimes the envy of those around him. Yet Heracles' path was never simple. Even allies could be dangerous in the wrong hands, and many attempted to deceive or manipulate him. He learned that wisdom was as vital as strength, to judge intentions, to measure risk, to anticipate betrayal. And all the while, Hera's eyes, invisible and unblinking, watched, ensuring that no moment of triumph came without its shadow of peril. Among his most notable encounters in this period was the Stymphalian birds, creatures with feathers like razors and eyes that gleamed with unnatural cunning. They descended upon villages with terrifying speed, tearing livestock and terrifying villagers. Heracles, armed with arrows and a pair of bronze clappers gifted by Athena,
flushed them from their dense marshes, and shot with unerring accuracy, each arrow felling a bird while avoiding collateral damage. It was a display not only of courage, but of precision and moral responsibility. His adventures began to form a pattern: danger, analysis, action, and reflection. Each feat strengthened him. Each challenge taught him patience. Each brush with death reminded him of the fragility of human life. And all the while, Hera's fury loomed, sometimes invisible, sometimes unmistakable, but always present. During this chapter of his life, Heracles also experienced moments of solitude that shaped his emotional core. After every battle, he would walk through forests or along riverbanks, reflecting on the lives he had touched, the destruction avoided, and the lessons learned. It was during these quiet moments that his compassion developed, the understanding that true heroism required not just power, but empathy and restraint. By now, Heracles was becoming more than a local legend. Travelers spoke his name with reverence, children imitated his feats in playgrounds, and elders told tales of his cunning and bravery by the fireside. He was no longer just the child who had wrestled serpents or lifted barrels. He was a force, a protector, a man shaped by trials yet guided by conscience. Hera's subtle assaults continued, growing more elaborate and dangerous. Once she unleashed a giant, enchanted bull upon the countryside, a creature that had eluded capture by every man in the region. Heracles pursued it tirelessly, tracking its every movement, using terrain and timing to his advantage, and finally subduing it without killing it. The villagers were awestruck, yet Heracles said nothing of his own prowess, only ensuring that life could continue without fear. In these first true trials, several truths crystallized for him. Strength without strategy was dangerous. Bravery without compassion was hollow. And even a demigod must learn humility to survive and protect. By the end of this period, Heracles had become a figure larger than life, yet deeply human, capable of extraordinary deeds, yet capable of reflection, empathy, and caution. And although much more awaited him, the 12 labors, the betrayals, the triumphs and tragedies, this chapter of his life marked the true emergence of Heracles, a young man whose courage, intelligence, and heart were already preparing him for legend.
The madness of Hera. As Heracles grew into full manhood, his legend spread far beyond Thebes. Bards sang of his victories, sculptors carved his likeness into marble. Children whispered his name as if invoking protection. But in Olympus, those same whispers burned like incense in Hera's fury. She had tolerated his survival far too long. Every tale of his heroism, every village that praised him, every mortal who dared to call him protector, each was a reminder of Zeus's betrayal and of her own wounded pride. And so Hera chose not to destroy him by brute force. No, she would unravel him from within. Heracles, unaware of the storm gathering above him, had settled into a semblance of peace. He had married Megara, the daughter of the Theban king, a woman of striking intelligence and quiet strength. Their home echoed with laughter and the tiny footsteps of children. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the demigod might finally know contentment. But Hera watches happiness the way a predator watches prey, with patience. On a moonless night, as the family slept, she descended silently into the chambers of his mind. Her touch was not physical, it was psychological, a whisper that twisted truth into delusion, memory into nightmare. When Heracles awoke, his reality had been rewritten.
In his eyes, the walls of his home shimmered and changed shape. The gentle figures of his wife and children became the distorted visages of enemies. He heard them call his name, not with love, but with mockery. The air thickened with illusion, and his divine strength turned against him. What followed cannot be described as a battle. It was madness given form. The demigod who had tamed monsters, who had faced storms and beasts, now fought the phantoms of his own mind. When the haze lifted, silence reigned, and in that silence lay the bodies of his wife and children, lifeless, still, forever beyond his reach. The horror struck him only after the illusions dissolved. He fell to his knees, the earth beneath him shaking from the weight of his despair. The same hands that had saved villages had destroyed what he loved most. The gods above were silent, the stars indifferent witnesses to his grief. Hercules wandered from Thebes, broken and hollow. The man who had been praised as a hero was now an exile, haunted, shattered, and consumed by a guilt that no mortal words could heal. He walked through forests and across rivers, seeking solitude, but found only memories. His laughter had vanished. His heart ached with the unbearable truth. His strength had failed to protect the only lives that truly mattered. And yet, within this abyss of despair, destiny began to turn. Because even the gods, cruel as they were, knew that no spirit could bear eternal torment without purpose. It was the oracle of Delphi, priestess of Apollo, voice of divine wisdom, who offered him a path toward redemption. "Your sins are great," she told him, her voice both sorrowful and divine. "But the gods demand balance. You will serve penance through labor, 12 tasks set before you, each impossible for any man, but not for you. Through these labors your soul may find peace, and the world will know what it means to be truly human." Hercules listened in silence. The words did not comfort him, but they gave his grief direction. He bowed his head and accepted the judgment. If atonement could not bring back his family, perhaps it could at least make sense of his suffering. And so Hercules set forth on a journey that would span the corners of the known world, from the burning plains of Libya to the frozen peaks of the Caucasus, from the depths of the sea to the gates of the underworld. Each task would demand more than muscle. It would test mind, soul, and spirit. But in this moment, before the first labor, before the glory, before the redemption, he was still a man lost in grief. He walked barefoot through dust and stone, the weight of his guilt pressing upon him like an invisible mountain. The world that had once celebrated him now whispered his name in pity. And Hera, watching from her golden throne, smiled faintly. For though she had not killed him, she had wounded him in a way that even immortality could not heal. Yet beneath her cruelty, something unexpected was stirring. Hercules, broken and tormented, began to understand the essence of true heroism. It was not victory, nor applause, nor divine favor. It was endurance, the quiet, relentless act of continuing on, even when every reason to do so had been stripped away. When the dawn finally broke, Hercules arose from the earth, his eyes hollow but steady. He gathered what little remained, a bow, a club, a cloak, and turned toward the horizon. The first rays of sunlight caught the edge of his face, and for the first time since that night, he did not look backwards. For ahead of him lay the labors, and though they would define his legend, they would also test his soul beyond measure. Hercules had lost everything, but in the ashes of loss, he would begin the long journey toward redemption, and perhaps, in time, forgiveness.
The first labor, the Nemean lion. The wind howled across the plains of Argolis as Hercules approached the shadowed hills of Nemea. The sky had dimmed to a weary bronze, and the trees whispered like ancient witnesses to what was about to unfold. Here, in this wilderness, a beast unlike any other prowled, a lion not born of nature, but of divine wrath. The creature was said to be invulnerable, its golden hide immune to blade and arrow alike, its roar enough to shake a man's courage loose from his bones. For years it had ravaged the countryside, devouring livestock, hunters, even warriors who came to claim its head. The people of Nemea had given up hope, their fields overgrown, their hearts resigned. And now into this silence came Hercules, alone, weary, and carrying not the arrogance of a hero, but the burden of a penitent soul. He had traveled far since the oracle's decree. Each mile had stripped away another layer of pride, leaving only purpose behind. When he reached the edge of the Nemean forest, he paused. The air was unnaturally still. Even the birds had abandoned song. Only the faint rumble of distant thunder hinted that the gods were watching. Hercules adjusted the lion-skin cloak that hung from his shoulders, not yet a trophy, but a symbol of his own mortality. He gripped his bow, its string taut and ready, and stepped into the dark. The forest swallowed him whole. The ground beneath his feet was damp, thick with the scent of rot and wildflowers. Every branch creaked like a warning, and then, faintly at first, he heard it, a low growl, deep as an earthquake, rolling through the underbrush. The Nemean lion was near. Hercules notched an arrow and waited. The shadows shifted. Two eyes, bright and gold as molten metal, blinked open. The beast emerged, vast, muscular, its mane glinting like bronze in the dim light. When it exhaled, the air shimmered with heat. Hercules raised his bow and let the arrow fly. It struck the creature squarely in the chest and snapped harmlessly against its hide. The lion's growl deepened into something almost human, a sound of amusement. Then it charged. The earth trembled under its weight. Hercules rolled aside just as claws the size of daggers tore through the trunk of a tree. Another arrow, another failure. The creature's hide was truly impierceable. Realizing this, Hercules cast aside his bow. If the lion could not be killed from afar, he would have to face it up close. Man against monster, flesh against legend. He followed the beast deeper into the woods, tracking its movements through broken branches and paw prints sunk deep in the soil. Eventually, he found its den, a cavern carved into the side of a cliff, its entrance littered with bones. The air reeked of death. Hercules drew his club and stepped inside. Darkness enveloped him. He could hear the beast breathing somewhere within, a slow, steady rhythm like the pulse of the earth. He felt the tremor of its movement before he saw it. Then, with a thunderous roar, it lunged from the shadows. The impact sent him crashing into the stone wall. Pain flared through his ribs, but he did not yield. He swung his club, a massive blow that would have shattered a bull's skull, but it splintered on the lion's head. The creature snarled, teeth flashing. Hercules had one choice left. He dropped the club.
When the beast leapt again, he caught it mid-air, his arms wrapping around its neck, his feet digging into the ground. The two tumbled in the dust, a storm of claws and muscle and raw fury. The lion's claws raked his skin, but Hercules did not let go. He summoned every ounce of divine strength, tightening his grip until the creature's struggles slowed, then ceased. Silence fell once more. When Hercules rose, his body was torn and bleeding, but his eyes were calm. The first labor was complete, but victory brought no joy, only exhaustion and a faint whisper of understanding. This was not a war for glory, it was penance. He examined the lion's hide and remembered what the oracle had said. Each labor will test not your strength, but your understanding of it. So he knelt beside the beast he had slain, not as a conqueror, but as a mourner. He honored it with a brief prayer. Forgive me, creature of gods and earth. You were not my enemy, but my trial. Then, following Athena's subtle guidance, he used the lion's own claws to cut through its hide, the only weapon sharp enough to pierce it. From that day forth, he would wear the skin as armor, a symbol not of conquest, but of survival. When he returned to King Eurystheus to present the hide, the cowardly king trembled at the sight of him. So great was his fear that he forbade Hercules from ever entering the city again. From then on, he was to present his victories outside the gates, as if heroism itself were too dangerous to witness. Hercules said nothing. He bowed his head, turned, and walked away. The lion's skin draped over his shoulders, its empty eyes staring toward the horizon. As he disappeared into the distance, the people of Greece began to whisper once more. The man who had killed the unkillable had returned. But among the gods, Hera merely narrowed her eyes. The first labor was done, yes, but 11 remained, each more cruel, more impossible than the last. And somewhere deep within Hercules, beneath the layers of sorrow and penance, a spark began to flicker, the faint, defiant heartbeat of a man who refused to surrender, no matter how heavy the will of the gods might become.
The second labor, the Lernaean Hydra. The road to Lerna was not one of sunlight and song. It wound through swamps, thick with fog and decay, where the ground oozed beneath each step, and the air carried the faint hiss of unseen things. Even birds avoided this place. Hercules moved carefully, his lion's skin cloak drawn close, the scent of salt and rot thick in his nostrils. The oracle had told him little, only that a creature born of the underworld had taken refuge near the marshes of Lerna, and that it had brought with it a poison so potent that even gods feared it. He came upon the edge of a dark lake just as twilight began to sink. The water shimmered with an oily sheen, and from beneath its surface rose the faint shapes of twisted roots. Or were they bodies? Hercules could not tell. He set his torch to a bundle of dry reeds, watching the flames struggle against the damped air. Then he heard it, a low hiss, long and slow, like a sigh from the deep. The Hydra was awake. From the black water it emerged, a monstrous serpent, its body coiled like living shadow, its many heads swaying hypnotically. Each head bore eyes that glowed an unnatural green, and when it exhaled, the air filled with the scent of venom. 9 heads, perhaps more, legends disagreed. But it was not the number that mattered. It was the endlessness of it. Hercules steadied his breath. This was not like the lion. The lion had been brute strength against brute strength. The Hydra was something else. Chaos itself, ever growing, ever renewing. He drew his sword and lunged. The blade flashed, cutting clean through one of the serpent's necks. A moment of silence, and then, from the wound, 2 new heads burst forth, hissing louder than before. The beast's laughter echoed through the swamp, a sound not made for mortal ears. For the first time since his madness, Hercules felt despair rise in him again. Every strike was answered with 2 more adversaries. The harder he fought, the more impossible the battle became. And high above, hidden in the mist, Hera watched, her smile faint, her satisfaction cruel. But fate, as always, has a way of weaving the unexpected. From the shadows came a flicker of light, his nephew Aeolus, who had secretly followed him. He was young, clever, and loyal beyond measure. "Uncle," he shouted, "if the heads will not stay dead, then we must burn the wounds before they can grow again." Hercules understood instantly. He nodded once, and together they devised a rhythm. Hercules would strike, and Aeolus would follow, pressing a flaming brand to the stump before new heads could form. The air filled with smoke and screams, the sound of fire against flesh, and slowly, impossibly, the Hydra began to falter. Head by head, they conquered the unending, until only one remained, the great central head, the immortal one, the source of its poison. Hercules hesitated. He knew that blade and flame would fail against this one. So, with a grim calm, he lifted his mighty club and brought it down with all his strength. The earth shook. The Hydra's last head fell silent. For a long moment, all was still. And then, with reverence, Hercules knelt and buried the head beneath a massive rock so that its poison could no longer seep into the world. But before leaving, he dipped his arrows in the creature's blood, a decision that one day would change his fate forever. For that venom, dark and divine, would remain deadly long after the Hydra was gone. When he returned to King Eurystheus, the coward once again refused to meet him in person. He listened from behind his bronze doors as the herald announced Heracles' success. And then, seeking to diminish the hero's achievement, Eurystheus declared, "This labor shall not count. You accepted help from another." Heracles said nothing. He simply turned away, his torchlight fading into the mist, his expression unreadable beneath the lion's hood. He knew now that redemption would not be granted easily, that every act of courage would be twisted, every victory tainted by divine malice. Yet, beneath his exhaustion, a quiet realization stirred. The Hydra had been more than a monster. It was a mirror, a reflection of the endless struggle inside him. For every guilt he tried to bury, 2 more rose in its place. And like the Hydra, his past could not be destroyed by rage alone. It had to be cauterized, faced, understood, and burned clean. That night, as the swamp lay still and Hera's laughter faded into the stars, Heracles sat by the dying fire and looked at his hands, scarred, burned, trembling slightly. He was no longer the reckless son of Zeus who sought fame. He was something rarer, a man beginning to understand his own suffering. Somewhere, an owl called out, a sound both mournful and wise. Heracles closed his eyes, letting the echoes of battle drift away. The air smelled of smoke and water. He was alone again, but for the first time that solitude felt almost sacred, because the road to redemption, he now knew, was not paved in glory. It was built from quiet endurance, from pain borne without bitterness, and from the courage to face what can never truly be killed.
The third labor, the Cyrenean hind. After the chaos of the Hydra, the silence of the Arcadian forests felt almost sacred. The air was cool, heavy with pine and mist, and for the first time in months, Hercules felt the weight of his thoughts lighten. No monster roared here, no venom hissed. Only the wind, the trees, and the distant murmur of a stream. His next task seemed simple, deceptively so. He was to capture the Cyrenean hind, a deer of such beauty that even the gods spoke of it with reverence. Its coat shone like molten gold under sunlight. Its antlers glimmered like polished silver, and it moved swifter than any arrow could fly. But it was sacred to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of all wild things. To harm it would mean to anger her, and Hercules had no wish to make another enemy among the gods. So he walked quietly through the forest, his footsteps soft against the moss. He knew that brute strength would not help him here. This was not a battle of might, but of patience. He followed faint tracks, the delicate print of hooves, the occasional brush of golden fur against a branch, until days turned to weeks and weeks into months. He crossed rivers, climbed hills, and slept beneath ancient trees. Seasons began to change. Autumn leaves turned gold and fell around him like whispers of time. Through it all, he kept searching. And as he searched, something began to shift inside him. The chase was no longer about redemption or obligation. It became a kind of meditation. He began to notice the smallest things, the way morning light spilled through branches, the soft hum of bees gathering nectar, the rhythm of his own breathing blending with the forest. For the first time since his madness, Hercules felt a fragile sense of peace. And then one dawn, he saw her. The Cyrenean hind stood on the far bank of a stream, her coat shimmering with the light of the rising sun. She was still, almost ethereal, her gaze calm but wary. Hercules froze. Even from across the water he could feel her presence, not like an animal's, but like a divine being's. He lowered his bow. He knew he could not harm her. Instead, he whispered softly, as though speaking to a goddess herself. "I do not come to hurt you, only to fulfill a promise. Forgive the trespass, but know that I seek no glory, only peace." The hind tilted her head slightly, her golden eyes reflecting the dawn. Then, without warning, she leapt, swift as wind, vanishing into the forest. Hercules sighed and followed. The pursuit lasted a year. Through mountain and meadow, rain and frost, he trailed her, never too close, never giving up. Each night he would whisper prayers to Artemis, asking her to understand his purpose. And perhaps she did. For one morning, as the mist hung low over the valley, he found the hind resting by a small spring. Quietly, gently, he approached. He moved as if time itself held its breath. Then, with a soft motion, he placed a net over her, not to harm, but to hold. The hind struggled, but not violently, as though she too understood that this was the way of fate. At that moment,
A light flared through the forest, silver and cold. Artemis appeared, her presence serene yet formidable. Moonlight gathered around her like armor. Hercules knelt immediately, bowing his head. "Son of Zeus, you dare to capture what is mine?" Hercules spoke softly, his words honest and steady. "Goddess of the wild, I meant no disrespect. The task was set upon me by another. If I have wronged you, let my life pay for it, but do not punish the innocent creature for my burden." For a long moment, Artemis said nothing. The forest held its breath. Then she stepped closer, her expression softening. "I see truth in you, Hercules, and I see suffering. You have carried your guilt far, but remember, not all strength is found in battle. Sometimes restraint is the greatest power of all." With that, she placed her hand on the hind's golden neck. "Take her to your king," she said. "Show him that the sacred can be touched without being broken. But return her to me unharmed, and your path shall remain clear." Hercules bowed deeply. When he returned to Eurystheus, the king was, as always, unimpressed. He hid behind his walls, muttering about impossible tasks and divine beasts. But Hercules did not care. He had seen something purer than any triumph, the harmony of strength and gentleness, of power held in peace. When he released the hind back into the forest, she paused for a moment and looked back at him, a silent acknowledgment between mortal and divine. Then she vanished once more into the endless green. As dusk settled, Hercules sat by the spring where she had rested. He closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the forest, a language older than gods or men. The wind brushed his hair. A single golden leaf fell into his palm, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled, quietly, faintly, as though beginning to remember what peace felt like.
The fourth labor, the Erymanthian boar. Winter had come early to Arcadia. The mountains stood cloaked in white, the sky a pale mirror of cold light. Each breath that left Hercules' lips turned instantly to frost. His lion-skin cloak, usually a symbol of triumph, now hung heavy and stiff with snow. He had been walking for days, following the distant sound of destruction, the echo of trees breaking, rocks rolling, and terrified hunters fleeing for their lives. Somewhere among those frozen ridges roamed the Erymanthian boar, a beast so massive it could uproot entire forests with a single charge. The villagers had begged Hercules to help them. The creature had trampled their fields, smashed through their herds, and left nothing but ruin in its wake. To them it was not an animal, it was a curse. But to Hercules it was another trial written by fate, another test from the gods who refused to let him rest. He climbed higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and the wind screamed like a chorus of lost souls. Snow blinded him, clawing at his eyes, but he pressed forward, step by step, breath by frozen breath. The world around him was endless white and silence. Only the faint marks of hooves in the snow told him he was not alone. Then, as dusk began to settle, the silence broke. A roar, not of a lion, but of something deeper, older. The earth itself seemed to shake. From behind a ridge, the Erymanthian boar thundered into view. It was a monster in every sense of the word. Its hide thick as iron, its tusks long as spears, and its breath steaming like a forge.
Snow melted wherever it struck the ground. Heracles stood still, letting the weight of the moment sink into him. This was not a creature to be slain recklessly. He needed cunning, not rage. So when the beast lowered its head and charged, Heracles did not meet it head-on, he ran. Through the forest he fled, his heavy steps leaving deep prints in the snow, the boar crashing after him, uprooting trees, tearing through drifts. The chase became a storm of sound and fury, the pounding of hooves, the snap of branches, the echo of thunder above. Heracles' heart pounded, not with fear, but with focus. He was guiding the beast higher, toward the summit, where the snow grew deep and treacherous. There, among the cliffs, he would have his chance. The climb was brutal. Ice cracked beneath his boots, and the wind screamed against his ears. The boar followed, relentless, blinded by its own fury. When at last they reached the highest ridge, Heracles turned suddenly, his body tense as a drawn bow. He shouted, not in fear, but in challenge. The boar bellowed and lunged. Heracles sidestepped at the final instant, and the beast plunged into a deep drift of snow, its massive body trapped beneath the weight of the frozen mountain. For a moment, the world went still again. The beast roared, thrashing wildly, but Heracles was faster. He seized its tusks, twisted, and forced the creature down until it lay exhausted, its breath steaming in great white clouds. When it finally went still, Heracles bound its legs with chains of bronze, careful not to kill it, for his task was to capture, not to slay. The climb back down the mountain was long and cruel. Heracles dragged the monstrous boar through snow and wind, step by slow step, until he reached the valleys below. The villagers emerged from their homes to see him, a figure of myth walking through the storm, a titan hauling the fury of nature itself. And when he came before King Eurystheus, the cowardly king once again retreated behind his bronze gates. From the safety of his walls, he peered out through a narrow crack, his eyes wide with terror at the sight of the living monster. "Take it away!" he cried. "Take it far from my city! I have seen enough!" Heracles said nothing. He simply stood there for a moment, the snow melting around his feet, and then turned to lead the beast back into the wild, where it would roam no more among men. When he finally released the boar into a distant glen, he rested against a rock, breathing hard, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. The world around him was silent again, the kind of silence that comes only after great violence has passed. He looked at the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise, staining the snow with faint gold, and for the first time in many labors, he felt something close to pride, not the arrogance of conquest, but the quiet pride of endurance, because he had learned something in those frozen hills, that strength is not always about the roar of battle. Sometimes it is about surviving the storm, holding on until the world grows still again. As he descended the mountain, the wind began to calm. A single hawk circled high above, its cry echoing faintly through the thin air. Heracles smiled to himself, the lion skin rippling in the breeze like a banner of defiance. He had faced beasts and gods, grief and madness, but the mountain had taught him this, that even the wildest fury eventually tires, and when it does, the one who endures wins.
The fifth labor, the Argean stables. After the mountains of Arcadia, Heracles longed for warmth, but fate had other plans. The gods, it seemed, were not finished testing his endurance. King Eurystheus sent him now to Elis to serve a man named Argeus,
a proud and wealthy king who owned more cattle than anyone in Greece. But there was one problem. His stables had not been cleaned in 30 years. The air around them was thick, not just with the stench of filth, but with the arrogance of a man who believed himself too mighty to deal with his own decay. When Hercules arrived, even he, who had wrestled lions and monsters, had to pause at the sight. Before him stretched an endless sea of filth, mud and dung piled higher than the walls of a fortress, the ground blackened with years of rot. Flies swarmed the air like dark snow. The river that ran nearby had long since turned away from this place, as if ashamed to witness it. Argeus greeted Heracles with a smirk. "So, son of Zeus, you've come to shovel muck." The courtiers laughed, for to them a hero was meant to fight dragons, not dung. But Heracles only smiled slightly. "Tell me, king," he said, "if I clean your stables in one day, will you reward me with 1/10 of your cattle?" Argeus, amused by what he thought was arrogance, agreed immediately. He had no faith that such a feat could be done, and saw no harm in humoring a fool. What Argeus did not know was that Heracles had no intention of using his hands. He walked the length of the stables, studying the land, the slope of the earth, the slow, steady movement of two great rivers nearby, the Alpheus and the Peneus. Then an idea struck him, an idea so simple, so grand, that only someone who truly understood both nature and effort could have conceived it. Heracles took up his club and began to work, not at the stables, but at the land itself. He tore through stone and soil, carving deep channels from the rivers toward the stables. The villagers gathered to watch, whispering in disbelief as he redirected the very course of water. By midday the rivers had begun to surge toward the filth-choked barns. The sound was deafening, a roar of nature awakened. Water thundered through the channels, bursting into the stables with the power of divine fury. The filth that had built up for 3 decades was swept away in a single, unstoppable tide. The stench that poisoned the land was drowned beneath a flood of purity. When it was done, the sun broke through the clouds, and the air was clean again, fresh, bright, almost sacred. The cattle stood in astonished silence, as if aware that something holy had passed through. Heracles leaned on his club, drenched but satisfied. He had done the impossible, not by strength alone, but by understanding how to move the world itself. But when he returned to Argeus, the king's pride could not bear the truth. "You cheated," Argeus thundered. "You used the rivers. That was not part of the bargain." Heracles' voice was calm but cold. "The bargain was to clean your stables. I did, in 1 day." The courtiers fell silent, but the king's heart was too proud, too small to admit defeat. He refused to pay Heracles what he had promised. Heracles turned away, his patience frayed. For all his labors, he was still learning this lesson. The hardest beasts to conquer were not lions or serpents. They were men. When he reported back to Eurystheus, the king declared that this labor did not count, since Heracles had been paid for his work. Another excuse, another insult, and yet Heracles said nothing. He simply bowed his head and accepted the next task. For he knew, now more than ever, that his labors were no longer about pleasing kings or even gods. They were about something quieter, deeper, the slow cleansing of the world and of himself. As he left the land of Elis behind, the river still flowed through the stables, washing what had been rotting for decades. And in that endless current, Hercules saw something of his own life, a constant fight to wash away the stains left by forces beyond his choosing. He walked into the sunset, his silhouette long against the gold light, the scent of clean earth rising behind him. And though the world would call it just another labor, Hercules knew this one had changed him. For sometimes to be truly strong is to cleanse what everyone else has learned to ignore.
The sixth labor, the Stymphalian birds. There are kinds of darkness that no torch can chase away. Not the kind that lives in caves or under mountains, but the kind that breathes, that moves, that waits. When Heracles arrived at the marshes of Stymphalia, the air already felt wrong. Thick mist coiled over the black water like smoke from some invisible fire, and the sound, oh, the sound, a faint, constant clattering, like blades whispering in the wind. The villagers had long abandoned this place. They spoke of birds that ate flesh, whose feathers could pierce bronze and whose wings cut the air with the scream of sharpened metal. No man dared to approach, for the sky itself had turned against them. Heracles stood at the edge of the marsh, his lion-skin cloak heavy with damp. He had faced monsters of muscle and fang, but this was different. How do you fight the sky? How do you strike what moves faster than thought? He waded into the mud, each step sinking deeper into the swamp's cold grip. The air grew colder, and the mist began to shimmer with movement. Then, without warning, the world above him erupted. Hundreds, no, thousands of birds took flight, the air shrieking with the sound of bronze feathers slicing wind. Their wings flashed like blades, their eyes burned like embers in a furnace. They descended as one, a storm of death from above. Heracles raised his shield, but the force of their assault drove him backward, the ground trembling beneath the rain of metallic feathers. Each one struck with the strength of an arrow. He swung his club, but what good was brute force against 1,000 wings? He could not reach them, could not even see clearly through the fog and blood. Every sound echoed 100-fold, as if the entire marsh was alive with laughter, cold, mechanical, endless. For the first time in many labors, Heracles felt something dangerously close to helplessness. The great hero, the son of Zeus, brought to his knees not by strength, but by sound, by swiftness, by something that refused to stand still. But gods have strange ways of helping. Athena, who had watched his journey with quiet admiration, took pity. She descended unseen and placed before him a strange gift, a pair of brazen castanets, forged by Hephaestus himself. When Heracles lifted them, the metal caught the light of the dim sun, and he understood. He struck them together. A piercing clang rang through the air, a sound not of war, but of defiance. The birds shrieked. The sound struck their senses like lightning through glass. In confusion and terror, they burst upward, breaking formation, scattering across the sky. Now Heracles had his chance. He reached for his bow, each arrow sharp and gleaming. His muscles drew taut, his breath slowed. He fired. Again and again his arrows flew, cutting through the air, piercing the birds as they fled. Feathers rained down like black snow, and for every bird that fell, another fled into the horizon. When at last the sky grew quiet, only the wind remained, sighing softly through the reeds. The marsh was still. The mist began to lift, revealing dark water glittering faintly in the pale light. Heracles stood alone, his bow still warm in his hand, his breath steady once more.
The smell of metal and decay lingered, but beneath it was something new, a clean scent, faint but real, as if the air itself had taken its first pure breath in years. Hercules gazed into the water. His reflection wavered, a man scarred, weary, yet unbroken. He had not slain every bird, but he had broken their dominion. Sometimes victory is not about destroying evil, but about restoring silence. As he began his journey back, he noticed that the first true sunlight had begun to pierce the clouds. It painted the marsh gold, and in that light Hercules saw what few ever would, that courage is not always about rage or roar. Sometimes it's standing in the fog until the darkness loses interest. When he returned to King Eurystheus, the cowardly monarch again demanded proof. Hercules simply opened his hand and let fall a single bronze feather, sharp enough to cut the king's finger when he tried to touch it. Eurystheus turned pale and retreated back behind his iron gates as he always did. But Hercules only smiled, because by now he understood something Eurystheus never would. Each labor was cleansing him, not from the sins of others, but from the storm that still raged in his own soul. He walked away, the marsh fading behind him like a bad dream, the wind carrying the faintest whisper of metal and memory. And if anyone had been there to listen closely, they might have heard a faint flutter, not of threat, but of peace, as one last bird rose quietly into the sky, its wings no longer weapons, but shadows passing into sunlight.
The seventh labor, the Cretan bull. The island of Crete shimmered under a restless sun, its blue horizons melting into the sea, a sea ruled by Poseidon, lord of waves and tempests. But even the gods grow angry when men forget to honor them. Years before Heracles' arrival, King Minos of Crete had made a promise to Poseidon. He would sacrifice whatever the god sent from the sea as proof of his divine favor. When Poseidon answered, it was with beauty, a bull unlike any other, white as foam, radiant as starlight upon the water. Its eyes gleamed with the fire of heaven, and its breath came like the wind before a storm. But Minos, seeing its perfection, broke his word. He kept the bull for himself and offered another in its place. Poseidon's wrath was silent but sure. He touched the creature's mind, and madness took hold. The bull tore through the fields of Crete, trampling crops, destroying villages, its roar echoing across the island like thunder in the bones of the earth. When Heracles arrived, the islanders spoke of it with trembling voices, the white bull that burned like lightning when it ran, whose eyes glowed red beneath the moon. Minos himself met Heracles by the sea, his face proud but pale. He would not admit his guilt, only muttered of a curse. Heracles listened and simply nodded. He had learned that kings rarely confessed their sins. They let others fight them instead. He walked out into the open plains, where the earth was cracked and dry from the beast's rampage. The wind smelled of salt and dust, and far in the distance came the sound, the deep rolling bellow of the bull. When it appeared, it was like a storm-given flesh. Its hide gleamed like polished marble, its horns sharp and silver-bright. It pawed the ground, snorting clouds of white mist that shimmered like ghosts in the air. Heracles stood his ground. The bull charged. The impact was like an earthquake. Dust exploded around them. Heracles was thrown backward, his hands scraping against the stony earth. He rose slowly, blood at his lip, and smiled. Beautiful, and angry. The bull came again, faster this time, its hooves tearing furrows through the soil. Hercules sidestepped, his hand shooting out like lightning to grasp its horn. The beast twisted, muscles surging like waves beneath its skin. Hercules was dragged, his feet gouging deep lines in the ground, but he held on. The struggle became almost holy. A man and a god-touched creature locked in a test of will, of endurance, of respect. For a moment, Hercules looked into the bull's eyes and saw not madness, but torment. This was no monster. It was a divine being punished for another's sin. Something inside him shifted. Instead of killing it, he spoke softly, his voice steady, commanding, but kind. "Enough," he said. "You have suffered long enough. Come back." Perhaps it was the tone, or perhaps the gods themselves grew weary of cruelty, but slowly the bull's trembling ceased. Its breathing slowed, and for a single heartbeat, man and god-touched creature stood still. Two creatures bound by fate and the failures of kings. Hercules moved then, swift and sure, slipping his arms around its neck, forcing it gently to the ground, without striking a single blow. When the bull lay calm, Hercules bound its legs with rope and led it back across the island. The people of Crete watched in awe, a hero walking beside the fury of Poseidon, not as captor and captive, but as two beings who had survived each other. At the shore, Minos came forward, his crown glinting in the dying light. He looked upon the subdued bull and saw both his sin and his shame reflected in its eyes. He whispered, "Take it. I want no part of it any more." Hercules said nothing. He simply nodded and turned away, leading the bull onto a waiting ship. The sea was calm that evening. Perhaps in some quiet way, Poseidon was appeased. When Hercules reached the mainland, he led the bull before King Eurystheus, who immediately screamed and hid behind his bronze gates, as he always did. Hercules released the creature, and it wandered free through the hills of Greece, its white form glimmering against the horizon like a ghost of the sea that once birthed it. They say it roamed for years, until its bloodline gave rise to another monster, the Minotaur, a dark mirror of the same sin, a reminder that every act of pride leaves echoes in the generations to come. But for now, as Hercules watched the bull disappear into the sunlit haze, he felt no pride, no victory, only the calm after storm, and the quiet understanding that strength alone cannot cleanse the world's arrogance. Only compassion can. He turned away, the salt wind brushing through his hair, his lion-skin cloak rippling like an old banner. Each labor left its mark, and this one, this strange, silent encounter, taught him that sometimes the hardest task is not conquering rage, but forgiving it.
The eighth labor, the mares of Diomedes. The wind in Thrace carried the scent of iron and blood. It was a land where mercy was forgotten, a place ruled by Diomedes, a son of Ares, the god of war himself. Diomedes was said to have eyes like steel and a heart that beat only for cruelty. He owned a stable filled not with ordinary horses, but monsters, 4 mares, wild and magnificent, whose teeth had been fed on the flesh of men. They were beautiful, but in the way that storms are beautiful, terrible, untamed, and deadly. When Heracles heard of them, he knew this labor would test something beyond muscle. To face beasts of blood, he would have to face the shadow within himself. The night he arrived, the sky was black and trembling with thunder. His small band of companions, among them a boy named Abderus, loyal and kind, followed him into the valley where the mares screamed against their chains. Their eyes gleamed red in the torchlight, their breath came in hot clouds, and when they reared, sparks flew from their hoofs like flint on stone. Abderus whispered, "They're not beasts, Lord, they're curses." Heracles said nothing. He approached the stables, the sound of his footsteps drowned beneath the horses' fury. Each one strained against its bonds, snarling like wolves. Diomedes appeared on the hill above, his armor black, his laughter cruel. "So the lion of Greece comes to steal my pets," he called. "Tell me, son of Zeus, will you feed them your flesh or the flesh of your friends?" Heracles' jaw tightened. He knew the type, men born of war, who believed brutality was strength. "Your cruelty ends tonight," he said simply. Diomedes smiled, then motioned to his soldiers. The ground shook as dozens of armed men rushed down the slope. Heracles turned to his followers. "Hold them back, but do not harm the innocent. Only defend." Then he strode forward, toward the stables, toward the mares whose screams filled the air like the cries of the damned. He smashed open the gates, and chaos burst forth. The mares thundered out, manes flying, jaws snapping, and eyes blazing with the hunger of centuries. Heracles moved like a storm himself, grabbing ropes, blocking their charge, but even he could not hold all 4. They circled him like demons. Then a cry. Abderus. The boy, brave and foolish, had tried to help. One of the mares had caught him, its teeth flashing, its strength unstoppable. By the time Heracles reached him, it was too late. The boy's lifeless form lay upon the trampled earth, and the horses were still dripping red. Heracles froze. The world went silent. Even the thunder paused, as if the sky itself held its breath. When he spoke, his voice was low, not with rage, but sorrow. "You've eaten enough of men. Tonight you'll taste the cruelty that birthed you." He seized Diomedes, who had come too close, and hurled him into the stable. The mares turned upon their master, and the circle of torment closed. For the first time in their cursed lives, they fed upon the flesh that had made them monsters. When it was done, Heracles led them away, silent and trembling. He washed them in the river, their eyes now calm, their rage gone like smoke after rain. He took them to Eurystheus, who, as always, hid in terror. But this time Heracles did not leave them. He released the mares into the open fields of Olympus itself, where the gods took them away, perhaps to cleanse them, perhaps to keep them as a reminder of what men become when cruelty rules their hearts. When Heracles returned to the valley, he built a small cairn of stones for Abderus. The boy had believed in him, and paid for it with his life. Kneeling before the grave, Heracles whispered, "I wanted to teach the world mercy, but every lesson is paid in blood." The wind stirred the grass, soft and mournful. Some say Zeus himself sent a breeze that night, as if to comfort his son. In time, a city rose there, Abdera, named for the boy who died with a hero's heart. And though the mares were gone, their legend remained, a warning to all who believed power without compassion could ever be noble. Heracles walked on, his figure fading into the dawn. Each labor was changing him, chiseling away the man of muscle and revealing something deeper, a man of soul.
The ninth labor, the belt of Hippolyta. Across the restless Aegean Sea, beyond the lands of kings and monsters, lay a nation like no other, the kingdom of the Amazons. It was said their laughter echoed through forests, their arrows flew straighter than truth, and their hearts bowed to no man. And among them ruled Hippolyta, a queen both fierce and kind, whose beauty was matched only by her wisdom. Upon her waist gleamed a gift, a golden girdle woven by Ares himself, a symbol of divine strength and sovereignty. It was this belt that Eurystheus demanded from Heracles, a token of female power stolen by male pride. The journey to the Amazons' island was long. Heracles sailed under a sky painted silver, the moon casting its path across dark waves. He was weary, but the sea soothed him. He thought not of conquest, but of the strange request, why a king would covet a woman's belt. When he reached the shores of Themyscira, he was greeted not with spears, but with curiosity. The Amazons surrounded him, eyes sharp, movements graceful as panthers. At their center stood Hippolyta. Her armor shimmered like dusk on bronze, and her gaze was unafraid. "Son of Zeus," she said softly, "I know who you are, and I know why you've come." Heracles bowed his head. "I seek your belt, my queen, but not through blood or battle. If you'd grant it, I'll leave in peace." A smile touched her lips. "You speak like no man who's ever come here before." And for the first time in many labors, Heracles was met not with rage or resistance, but understanding. Hippolyta invited him to her camp. They shared stories by the fire, and laughter filled the night. He spoke of his trials, she of her sisters and their freedom. There was a quiet respect between them, two warriors who carried the weight of their people, each in their own way. But peace is a fragile flame, and jealousy is the wind that kills it. High above, unseen, Hera watched. The queen of the gods, still bitter, still cruel, could not stand to see harmony where she had wished for ruin. She descended upon the island disguised as an Amazon warrior, whispering lies into the ears of Hippolyta's followers. "Heracles is here to take your queen, to enslave her, to destroy your people." Fear spread like wildfire. The Amazons, loyal and fierce, snatched their weapons and rushed to defend their queen. Heracles awoke to chaos, to the sound of battle cries and the clash of steel. Arrows rained down like black rain. He tried to call out, "It's a mistake, stop!" But the storm had already broken. In the confusion, Hippolyta herself rode forward, trying to stop the fight. But in the madness, one arrow found its mark, piercing her heart. Heracles caught her as she fell. Her eyes, once bright, now dimmed with pain.
"Not your fault," she whispered. "Don't let them forget who we were." And then she was gone. The battle stilled. The Amazons, realizing the truth, fell silent. Hercules laid her gently upon the earth, and with trembling hands removed the golden girdle, not as a trophy, but as a promise. He buried her by the sea, where the waves could sing her name forever. For days after, he remained there, watching the horizon where her laughter used to live. Some say the wind still carries her voice, echoing across the waters, whenever a woman stands unbroken. When Heracles returned to Eurystheus, the king took the belt with greedy eyes, but the hero felt no pride, only the hollow ache of loss. He had not won a battle, he had survived a tragedy. That night, beneath the same stars that had once watched him laugh with Hippolyta, Heracles whispered to himself, "Strength without kindness is nothing. Victory without peace is just another wound." And the gods, for once, were silent.
The 10th labor, the cattle of Geryon. The horizon burned gold and crimson, a molten line where the sky met the edge of the world. Hercules stood at that border, the place the poets called Erythea, the red island where the sun laid its head to rest. He had come farther than any mortal man, beyond deserts where bones whispered in the sand, beyond mountains that seemed to claw at heaven, beyond the reach of even the gods' laughter. His task was to steal the cattle of Geryon, a giant born of the sea god Chrysaor and the monster Caleroe, a being with 3 heads, 3 bodies, and 1 merciless heart. But before Hercules could face the monster, he had to face the world itself. The journey began in suffering. The sun above scorched the land, its heat so fierce it burned the very air. Days turned into mirages, rivers dried into ghosts. Hercules, weary and parched, lifted his hands to the heavens and cried out, "Father Zeus, must even the sun itself be my enemy?" Far above, Helios, the god of the sun, heard his plea. But instead of anger, he felt amusement. "You dare challenge my fire, mortal?" he said, his voice echoing like thunder wrapped in flame. Hercules did not kneel. "I seek no battle, only mercy." And the god, impressed by such courage, offered him a gift, a golden cup, vast and radiant, the same vessel Helios used to sail his chariot through the night. "Take it," Helios said. "Cross the sea as I do. Return it when your labor is done." And so Hercules sailed across the great ocean, cradled in the cup of the sun, a god's vessel carrying a man. The waves shimmered beneath him, and the stars bowed low to watch. When he reached Erythea, the land of crimson light, the air smelled of iron and salt. The earth trembled, for Geryon's realm was guarded by a beast even gods feared, Orthrus, the 2-headed hound, brother of Cerberus. Hercules met the creature head-on. Its growls echoed like thunder from 2 throats, its teeth glinting white as bone. One swift blow from Hercules's club, and silence fell. Then came Eurytion, the herdsman of Geryon, a man of loyalty, not evil. He lifted his spear, trembling. "Go back, stranger. These cattle are not yours to claim." Hercules lowered his weapon. "I do not wish to kill you. Leave and live."
But Eurytion stood firm. Honor bound him tighter than fear. So the hero did what he must. He struck once, cleanly, mercifully. The man fell beside the hound he had tended all his life. For a long time Hercules did not move. He looked at them both and whispered, "May your loyalty be remembered." But the earth shook again, and from the cliffs above Geryon appeared. He was vast, 3 bodies moving in unison, 3 faces glaring with fury, each armed with a spear that gleamed like molten gold. "Thief!" Geryon roared. "Do you think the labors of men reach the realm of gods?" Hercules gripped his bow. "I think pain reaches everywhere." They clashed. Arrows sang through the air. Sparks flew. The sound of steel echoed across the sea. Each blow from Geryon was like a hammer on thunder, but Hercules stood firm. When one body fell, 2 more advanced. When 2 fell, the last screamed vengeance. Hercules drew his final arrow, dipped in the poison of the Hydra. He took aim, and with a whisper to the gods, let it fly. It struck Geryon's chest, and all 3 hearts stopped together. The monster fell, and the world exhaled. Hercules gathered the crimson cattle, their hides glowing faintly under the dying sun. He placed them aboard Helios's golden cup and sailed back across the ocean, the seas singing beneath him. When he returned the vessel, Helios smiled and said, "You have walked where even light grows weary. You have earned your peace." But peace was still far away. On his journey home, Hercules faced thieves, storms, and a king's greed. Each obstacle tested his endurance. Each loss carved deeper lines in his soul. When he finally stood again before Eurystheus, dust and salt upon his skin, the king hid behind his throne, as always. Hercules said nothing. He merely released the cattle, watching them wander free into the fields of Greece. And for a brief moment, the hero smiled, because for once he had taken life only when forced, and given freedom when he could. That night, he looked up at the stars. The same constellations he had once seen from Greece now looked smaller, softer. He realized something then, that every step farther from home was also a step closer to the divine, not because of strength, but because of understanding. The farther he traveled, the more human he became.
The 11th labor, the apples of the Hesperides. The sky beyond the western sea glowed like an ember fading to ash. Heracles stood upon a cliff, the wind pulling at his cloak, staring toward a horizon that was said to end in paradise. This time his task was stranger than any before, to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, fruits said to grant immortality, hidden within a garden at the edge of the world. No mortal had ever seen it. Few even believed it existed. But Heracles no longer questioned. After 10 labors, 10 worlds conquered and lost, he had learned that truth and myth often shared the same heartbeat. He began his journey north and west, following whispers, chasing the edges of old maps drawn by trembling hands. His first stop was Libya, where he encountered the giant Antaeus, son of the earth. Antaeus was invincible so long as his feet touched the ground,
and he challenged every traveler who passed. The giant grinned. "No man walks here without wrestling me, demigod. Will you try your luck?" Hercules nodded. They grappled, sand flying, the ground shaking beneath their struggle. Every time Hercules threw him down, Antaeus rose stronger. Then Hercules saw the truth. The earth itself was feeding him. So Hercules lifted him high, away from the soil that birthed him, and crushed the breath from his chest. When the giant fell, the earth did not stir. He walked on, the horizon shimmering like a mirage. Days turned to weeks. He crossed deserts and mountains, and finally came upon a shadowed land, the realm of Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the sky. Atlas stood tall as a mountain, muscles straining beneath the weight of the heavens. His face was carved in stone and sorrow. Hercules called out, "Great Titan, I seek the golden apples of your daughters, the Hesperides. Can you help me?" Atlas laughed, the sound like rolling thunder. "You mortals never tire of reaching for what was not meant for your kind." Hercules bowed his head. "I do not seek immortality, only to finish what fate demands." The Titan regarded him, and for the first time in eternity, smiled faintly. "Then we may both find our freedom." He offered a deal. "If you will hold the heavens for me, just for a while, I will fetch the apples myself." Hercules looked up. The sky loomed heavy, swirling with fire and stars. The air seemed to tremble beneath its weight. Still, he agreed. He positioned himself where Atlas stood, set his feet, bent his knees, and took the firmament upon his shoulders. The world groaned. The weight of creation pressed into his bones. Every heartbeat was thunder, every breath a storm. Time lost meaning. He could not tell if moments or centuries passed. But at last, Atlas returned, 3 golden apples shining in his hands. Their light was not that of metal, but of memory and eternity, a glow that seemed to whisper promises of peace and endless rest. Atlas looked at the sky, then at Hercules. "He has a thought," he said slowly. "Perhaps I will take these apples myself to Eurystheus. You may continue holding the heavens. After all, you look strong enough." Hercules' heart pounded, but he smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "As you wish, great Titan," he said. "But if you could just hold the heavens again for a moment, so I might adjust the cloak on my shoulders, then I'll take your burden gladly." Atlas, flattered and unsuspecting, set down the apples and took back the heavens. Hercules picked up the apples. He met Atlas's gaze one last time and said softly, "Thank you." And before the Titan could reply, Hercules was gone, his footsteps fading into the wind. He walked through twilight for days, the apples heavy in his hands, their glow reflecting in his weary eyes. He thought of the giants he had killed, the kings he had humbled, the women he could not save. And he wondered if immortality meant never being free from one's own past. When he reached Eurystheus, the king recoiled from the light. "He take them away," he said, trembling. "Such power is not for mortals." And so he returned them to the gods, to Athena, who placed them once more in the garden at the edge of the world. Hercules bowed. "I have held the sky," he said quietly. "I ask only to stand beneath it now." That night, he dreamed of a garden bathed in eternal dusk, where the Hesperides laughed softly beneath golden boughs, and somewhere, unseen, a dragon coiled gently around the roots of the world, guarding peace from those who would take it. When Heracles awoke, the stars above seemed closer, as though they had watched and approved.
The final labor, the hound of Hades. The air was cold enough to still a heartbeat. Morning light touched the mountains of Taenarum, the place said to be one of the gates to the underworld. Heracles stood before the mouth of a cave that seemed to breathe darkness. This was no ordinary labor. This was a descent into death itself. Eurystheus, trembling behind his throne, had demanded it. "Bring me Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guards the gates of Hades. Bring him here if you truly serve the gods." Heracles said nothing. He only bowed his head and began to walk. There was no weapon in his hands, no armor on his shoulders, only the lion skin, worn and torn, and the weight of every sin, every victory, every cry he had left behind. The cave swallowed him whole. Its breath was damp, cold, endless. He followed the whispers of lost souls, faint as falling ash, until even his heartbeat seemed to fade. Then the world opened into shadow. He stood upon the banks of the Styx, the black river that divides the living from the dead. A boat slid silently through the fog. Its ferryman Charon lifted his hollow eyes. "No living man crosses this river." Heracles reached into his cloak and drew forth a golden coin. "Then take this, boatman," he said softly, "for I come not to steal, but to see." The ferryman studied him for a long time. Then, without a word, he let him board. The river moved like a wound that never healed. Around them the voices of the dead whispered, some pleading, some cursing, some calling Heracles by names only gods remembered. When they reached the far shore, the air thickened with the scent of fire and sorrow. The underworld stretched before him, an endless plain of gray stone where the dead wandered in silence. He saw kings without crowns, warriors who still reached for swords that no longer existed, mothers calling for children who would never answer. Heracles knelt among them and whispered, "I have known your pain. I too have buried my peace beneath the weight of duty." For a moment, the wind itself seemed to listen. Then came a figure of shadow and light. Hades, lord of the dead, with eyes that held the memory of all things lost. "Son of Zeus," Hades said, his voice echoing like iron against eternity, "why do you disturb the peace of my realm?" Heracles bowed. "I seek not to defy you, great lord. I come to complete my final task, to bring your hound to the world above." Hades studied him,
and a small cold smile touched his lips. "Then take him then, if you can, but use no weapon. If you can master Cerberus with strength alone, I shall allow it." From the shadows came a growl like thunder. 3 heads rose, each one bearing a different expression: rage, sorrow, hunger. Cerberus, the guardian of death, his black fur shining like obsidian flame. He towered over Hercules, the ground trembling beneath his steps. Each breath scorched the air, each eye burned with memory, as if he remembered every soul that had ever passed his gate. Hercules did not draw his sword. He spread his arms, and when Cerberus lunged, he caught the beast by its throats. The struggle shook the caverns of Hades. Claws ripped through the lion's skin. Fangs sank into his flesh. But Hercules held on. He wrapped his arms around the creature, his strength forged by every trial he had endured. And slowly, impossibly, the great hound bowed its heads, not in defeat, but in understanding. For in Heracles' eyes it saw something even Hades did not possess: mercy. The lord of the underworld stepped forward, silent. "You have done as few could. Take him then. But remember, mortal, none who walk among the dead leave unchanged." Heracles nodded. He took Cerberus gently, guiding him toward the light of the upper world. Each step felt heavier than the last. The earth seemed to resist his return. When he emerged at last from the mouth of the cave, the sky above was blinding. The sun burned his eyes. Cerberus whimpered and turned, retreating into shadow, back to where he belonged. Heracles stood alone on the mountainside, bloodied, trembling, but alive. He had conquered death itself, not by killing, but by enduring. When he returned to Eurystheus, the cowardly king fell to his knees in terror at the sight of the hound. "Enough!" he cried. "Your labors are done. Take the creature away." Heracles smiled faintly. "I have," he said, and let Cerberus vanish back into the dark from which he came. Then, without another word, he turned his back on the palace. The labors were over, but his journey, his true one, had only just begun. Years later, when the fires of his mortal life finally burned low, Heracles built his own funeral pyre atop Mount Oeta. He lay on it, the lion skin beneath his head, the bow and club beside him. He looked to the sky, the same sky he once held on his shoulders, and whispered, "Father, I am ready." The flames rose, fierce and golden, and as they consumed the mortal shell, a storm gathered above. Lightning split the heavens, and from the smoke rose the immortal form of Heracles, his pain gone, his heart at peace. He ascended to Olympus, welcomed not as a servant, but as a god. The mortals below would tell his story for millennia, of the man who bore every burden, fought every monster, and still found room in his heart for kindness. That night, in some quiet corner of the world, a traveler looked up at the stars and thought they saw a lion's shape glowing faintly in the heavens. And perhaps, if one listened closely enough, they could still hear a calm, deep voice whispering through the ages, "Strength is not in the hands, but in the heart that forgives.